In this video, A&P1 students, we are going to continue talking about the integumentary system. Now, I'm going to go to our learning objectives. So we are now we're kind of moving away from the epidermis. That's what we've been focusing on through most of our learning objectives for this chapter. So now we're going to move to the dermis, which is that deepest layer of the integument, and talk about its characteristics, and then we'll also talk a little bit more about the hypodermis, which is also called the subcutaneous layer, and we'll talk about some of its characteristics as well. All right, so let's go to our textbook. So recall that our dermis is below the epidermis, and it's this layer here. So we're going to go down to our information on the dermis. All right, so the dermis, first thing we want to do is talk about what type of tissue is the primary tissue within the dermis. And it's kind of a mixture. So you have areolar connective tissue. So that's present in the dermis. And then you also have this dense, irregular connective tissue. That's also present in the dermis. So areolar connective tissue and dense, irregular connective tissue are the two primary tissue types in the dermis. And so what that means is, if you recall from lab, especially with the areolar, it contains primarily collagen fibers, which is a protein, a fibrous protein, and then elastin or elastic fibers, which again is a fibrous protein, which just means they're usually very thin and long, more linear, so they look like long fibers. So that is the primary tissue types that's present in the dermis. Now you do have some other components of the dermis that you don't see in the epidermis, and those are we call them the skin accessory structures. So that would be things like sweat glands and sebaceous glands and the hair follicles. We have blood vessels in there. The tactile cells or the sensory receptors are in there. Smooth muscle, which is on that erector pili muscle, that's present in there. So that's where most of our accessory structures are located, is in the dermis. So you should be familiar with all those accessory structures that are located in the dermis. Now we also have something called a dendritic cell. So this is something we haven't talked about yet. But the dendritic cell, that is a cell that is part of the immune system. So that cell is there if in case something would be able to get through the skin. Usually that's through some sort of break in the skin, like a cut. Then if it was like, say, a bacteria, the dendritic cells that are present in the dermis would be able to hopefully see that bacteria and destroy it before it got any farther into the body. So we do have some dendritic cells in the dermis as well as these skin accessory structures. All right, so that is our kind of components and makeup of our dermis. So now we're going to look at, I didn't realize there's a picture here showing the dermis. Okay, so now we're going to look at some things that you should be familiar with when it comes to the dermis and its structure and function, because it'll be a practical significance to you. Okay, so we do have different layers in the dermis. There's like the papillary layer and the reticular layer. I don't feel like that's real important to know, so I don't ask questions, I should say, about those layers in the dermis. I just have you know the dermis is made up of primarily areolar connective tissue and also the dense irregular connective tissue. So, but I always want to highlight the capillaries. Those are like the smallest blood vessels in the body, the capillaries. So remember up here we said in the dermis that we have blood vessels. So here you can see these blood vessels that are really like in the superficial part of the dermis. They're just like right there next to the epidermis. And so something to realize is that the epidermis, if you look at it, and we've already talked about it in detail, there are no blood vessels in the dermis. So we don't have any, there are no blood vessels in the epidermis. So we don't have any in there. But we do have living cells in there, the keratinocytes. The ones in the stratum corneum aren't living, but in all those other layers we have living keratinocytes. So they're going to need nutrients and oxygen from the blood. So how they get that, how the keratinocytes that are in the epidermis get their nutrients and oxygen from the blood is from these blood vessels that are in the dermis, that are close to the dermis, or to the epidermis. And so any nutrients and oxygen will diffuse, so it means they'll move from an area where they're in high concentration to an area where they're in low concentration. And they'll diffuse through the dermis and then get to those cells, the living keratinocytes that are in that epidermis. So that is how our epidermis gets its blood, since it doesn't actually have blood vessels within its tissue. Okay. So we're going to move on here, and the other thing that we're going to talk about when we talk about the dermis is the lines of cleavage and stretch marks. So again, this is where we talk more about some practical significance of the dermis and knowing its structure and function. So when we are talking about the dermis and all the collagen and elastin fibers that are in the skin, they are there to provide support and resist stress that will happen with like common body movements that we make. So how they're set up in the, how they're kind of arranged in the dermis is they're arranged in parallel bundles. So remember they're long fiber type proteins, so they're arranged in these long parallel bundles. And then it depends on what area of the body we're talking about, like which way those parallel bundles are oriented. So we call this lines of cleavage, and so it's probably best to look at the picture so you can kind of realize what we're talking about. So these little purple lines, which you can't see, but these are the purple lines are just showing showing the direction of those parallel bundles of collagen fibers. So you can see that, across your upper abdomen, you have ones that are parallel bundles of collagen fibers that are running horizontal or transverse across there. And then if you look at your lower abdomen, you'll notice that they're also parallel, but they're kind of running in more of a diagonal direction. And you can look at your, ones on your skin of your head and face, legs. You can see like ones on your thigh kind of run diagonal from kind of the lateral side of your thigh to the medial side of your thigh. So those are lines of cleavage. And so how that kind of knowledge of those lines of cleavage, so how those parallel bundles of collagen and elastin fibers are running, that helps when we have like an injury. So they gave an example of an injury located here across the upper abdomen. And that injury occurred perpendicular to the lines of cleavage. So what that means is the dermis with its collagen and fiber parallel bundles here, that would cause the skin edges to be kind of pulled apart. So that'll kind of like gape open. And that's just because that lesion, that laceration here, is not running parallel with those parallel fibers that are in the dermis. So that one's going to be, if you let it like heal without any sort of sutures, it's going to take longer to heal. It's going to be a little bit delayed because those ends aren't like right next to each other. So a lot of times what we'll do is we'll suture this back together. So we'll actually, use a special suture and special like maybe, type of suture knot, and we'll pull those edges together to increase, kind of shorten the wound healing. So that might be something done. Now, if we have an injury like down here on the calf, kind of on the back side of the calf, then it's parallel with our bundles of collagen and elastin fibers, there's going to be less gaping there. Those skin edges are actually going to be, kind of stay together most of the time if you don't move your leg a lot. And so that is more likely to have like a more normal amount of wound healing time because those skin edges are close together and those collagen and elastin fiber parallel bundles are kind of holding that skin edges together there. So probably more going to heal more quickly. So that's the kind of the practical reason. It's good to know about the lines of cleavage on there. So then, we're more likely to maybe have some issues in healing more with this one. So we may be more inclined to intervene a little bit more with this type of injury than maybe this one. So, okay, so that is our lines of cleavage. And then the last thing we'll talk about with dermis is the stretch marks. So everybody's probably heard about stretch marks, generally seen in women, not to say men can't get them, but generally seen in women associated with pregnancy, but it can be seen in other people too, men or women, not associated with pregnancy. But anything that causes the skin to stretch, and so the skin has this amazing ability. Remember, we have the collagen fibers in there. So they give the dermis and the skin its strength, so it can, handle forces pulling on it. And then the elastic fibers, that's the one that gives the ability of the skin to stretch and also like go back to its normal position too, so recoil. So those are very, very good functions of those, but you can overwhelm those functions of being strong and stretchy and recoiling. And then if you have that where you stretch the skin beyond its capacity and you start to get breaking of those fibers, what can happen is you can get a visible mark on the skin, which they call stretch mark. And that's just because of the excessive stretching of the skin and breaking of fibers, and the cells that produce those fibers don't have a high, fast mitotic rate. They don't undergo mitosis, rapidly or often. So once they get broken, you kind of lose them, and they remain torn and don't get replaced. So then you can see some of that with your stretch marks. So, all right. So that is our dermis. And then I'm going to stop this video, and then we'll talk in the next video about the hypodermis. So then we'll start talking about this layer that's underneath the integument, also called the subcutaneous layer. And we'll talk about its characteristics. So I'll see you in the next video.